please. So I'm going to continue to share with you from Matthew chapter 26. And get myself organized here. Yeah, kids, if kids ministry will happen now. And let me just find my spot. So last Sunday we were in Matthew chapter 26, and we looked in that chapter. It's a long chapter, 75 verses. I thought, oh, this is a biggie. Last Sunday we looked at 3 incidents in Matthew 26 where we focused in on and we contrasted the behavior of Peter and the behavior of Jesus. On all 3 occasions that we looked at, Peter failed. Peter struck out. Peter showed us what not to do. While Jesus, in all 3 incidents, succeeded in the greatest way possible. He hit the ball out of the park every time, and he modeled for us what we should do, what to do. And I suggested that in Peter we have a picture. We have a picture of one force, one influence that is within us as Christians, that pulls us towards failure, that pulls us towards what we shouldn't do, what the Bible calls our flesh, our sinful nature. While in Jesus, we have a picture of the other force, the other influence within us that pulls us towards success, that pulls us towards what we should do, that the Bible refers to as the Spirit, who is the Spirit, of course, of Jesus in us, who resides, who is in every believer, in every Christian. So I want to continue today in Matthew 26, and I want to start at the betrayal of Jesus, the 3rd incident we looked at last Sunday. Remember the 3rd rung of our ladder? We had our 3-rung ladder. And then I want to go forward from there. I want to go forward from Jesus' betrayal to his trial, and then to Peter's denial of him, of Jesus. I want to use those events to focus in on, to unpack a particular phenomenon, a particular thing. And it's the matter of security. Our own personal level of security or insecurity. Insecurity. Whether we experience feeling secure in our lives, or whether we experience being and feeling insecure. Because I would propose that in Jesus' betrayal, trial, and Peter's denial of him, in Jesus you have a man who is incredibly secure. While in Peter you have a man who was very insecure. And Jesus shows us the classic signs of a person who was secure. And it's amazing how secure he was, particularly in the circumstances he found himself in. And in that, Jesus shows us how we can be secure, how we can become more secure and experience the security that God gives us in Christ more. While Peter shows us many of the classic signs of insecurity, he shows us what to avoid so we don't become more like him, more insecure. Now, why does this matter? Why does this matter? Why would I take up one of your precious Sunday mornings to speak to you about the matter of being secure or insecure? Well, let me just say this. Our goal, our perpetual, our 24/7 goal as Christians is to be influenced by the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus within us. We want him to be at the root. We want him to be the source of what we do. Him to be who and what we act out of, the Holy Spirit. And we want to avoid acting out of the other force, the other influence, out of our flesh, out of our sinful nature. And if and when we do act out of our sinful nature, that can take many forms. We all know that, don't we? We can act out of hatred. We can act out of jealousy. We can act out of bitterness. We can act out of anger. The ugly list goes on. All the expressions of our sinful nature. And one thing on the list that commonly trips me up is the matter of insecurity. Insecurity. Acting out of insecurity. And in my own life, I've found insecurity can express itself in many ways. It has many forms. In fact, quite often, this is my experience. I'll do something, I'll say something, I'll think something, followed by a loss of peace, a sense that wasn't healthy. And initially, I'm not sure why. I'm thinking, I didn't lie, I didn't steal, I didn't smoke, I didn't, And then it dawns on me, my insecurity. There it goes again. There it goes again. That's what it was. That's what I was acting out of. That's how I responded, out of my insecurity. That's what was at the root of that response, that emotion, that behavior. And so in my world, I find insecurity challenging in that way because it has a lot of faces. It can express itself in all sorts of ways, and therefore sometimes I find it hard to recognize within myself. And I found in Matthew 26, Peter he shows us many of those faces of insecurity, many ways in which insecurity expresses itself. So as one at times tripped up by insecurity, it's a chapter that's been helpful to me. Now, I don't know if insecurity ever tripped you up. I don't know. But I thought if it's an issue for me, there might be just one other person in the room for whom it's also an issue. One other person who can relate. So if I'm right, whoever you are, I hope this message helps you. And if there's more than one person with the issue who's helped, then that's a bonus. Okay. I want to begin with Peter and see how he models for us insecurity, someone who's insecure. And some of this will overlap with some of what we said about Peter in the first of these three messages from Matthew 26. Do you remember the incident in the middle of Jesus' betrayal when Peter loses it and he takes out his sword and he cuts off someone's ear, the high priest's servant's ear? The servant was part of the crowd who came to arrest Jesus. And in the message about how Peter shows us how our flesh, our sinful nature behaves, I pointed out that Peter's anger, and you've got to be pretty angry to take someone's ear off, right? The Peter's anger, in his anger, he probably wished it had been Judas's ear. It wasn't. But he probably wished it had been. Because in reflecting on the incident, I asked myself, who and what exactly was Peter angry at? Who? What exactly? And the thought came to me, maybe Judas. Judas, because Judas had been one of them. Judas had been one of the boys. Judas had been one of the gang. And here he was, he'd jumped ships, and now he was working for the enemy, destroying and blowing up the family, the intimate school and community that had so changed them all, that revolved around Jesus. Here he was betraying that beloved master teacher who'd done nothing but be good to them. I'd have been mad at Judas if I'd been Peter. So first Peter is mad. He's angry. And you know also, as well as that, Peter's trying to survive. Peter's trying to survive. He felt threatened. He felt unsafe. He felt in danger when this crowd arrived with clubs and swords, as I mentioned a couple of weeks back. The ear coming off was Peter's effort to control the situation, to take control of a situation that he felt to him out of control. So Peter was angry. He felt threatened. He took off an ear. He sought to take control by engaging in a conflict. Let's just unpack that little piece a little bit more. Judas arrived with a mob, right? With weapons, with swords and clubs. When Peter saw that, as I say, he felt threatened. He felt powerless. And so he pulled out his weapon. He pulled out his sword. He sought to exert power. He sought to seize power. He sought to take back control. And so he took off an ear. And I thought to myself, we have a name for that. We call it a power struggle. A power struggle. Peter got drawn into a power struggle with Judas. He engaged in a power struggle with Judas. And so I've mentioned quite a list of things that took place in Peter. Things that he felt, behaviors he displayed, that were behaviors of his flesh, his sinful nature. And I've said that our sinful nature is a bag of many, many different unhealthy behaviors. And if in Peter's case we dig a little deeper, okay, his behavior, etc., came from his sinful nature, but what exactly in his sinful nature did it come from? What more specifically was at the root of his behaviors, his reactions, his responses? One way to express that would be insecurity. Insecurity was at the root. Insecurity can lead, as it did in Peter, to anger, to us feeling threatened, to us feeling powerless, to feeling the need to take control, and us then engaging in a conflict, and in doing so getting drawn into a power struggle. Anger, feeling threatened, powerless, trying to take control, engaging in power struggles. Some classic fruits of insecurity. Insecurity can express itself in all those ways. Because of it, like I say, we feel threatened. We feel powerless in a situation. That leads to anger, because anger can be our sword, can't it? Anger can be our sword, our weapon with which we're going to take control. We're going to win this fight. We're going to win this argument. We're going to win this conflict. And so then we're drawn into a power struggle. Why does insecurity give rise to those feelings and those behaviors? Those destructive, toxic, dysfunctional feelings and behaviors? Because at the root of insecurity is lies. I'm not safe. I'm not valued. I'm not wanted. I don't have what I need. For a believer, nothing could be further from the truth. Those are all bald-faced lies for the believer. I'm not safe. I'm not valued. I'm not wanted. I don't have what I need. Lie after lie after lie. As believers, we're always safe. We're always safe. We're always valued. We're always wanted. And at the most significant level, we always have what we need. We always have what we need. When I say safe, I'm not meaning primarily physically safe, because even if someone takes our physical life, even if that's taken from us, as Christians, we're still safe. We're still valued. We're still wanted. We still have what we need. Because if we physically die, the truth is we don't die. Death for us is a passage to our true home. To our true home, where we are more alive than ever. Where we are more alive than ever. For the believer, we have a safety, we have a security, we have a value, and we have assets that no person, no word, no weapon, no sword or club can take from us. We're rich. We're blessed. Absolutely. And so Peter, out of insecurity, entered a conflict, a power struggle that was not his fight to fight. When he did that, Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword in its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels?" Jesus pointed out to Peter that if there needed to be a power struggle, God has no shortage of angels to come and fight for them. But Jesus discerned that at that point, on this occasion, there wasn't a need for a power struggle. There wasn't a need for a conflict. And so he didn't call on the angels. Jesus, being secure in what his Father was up to. He was secure in what his Father was up to, in his plan. Despite how out of control the situation looked, but despite how out of control naturally it would have felt, Jesus remained secure in a safe place, believing his Father had the situation under control, under his influence. Jesus believed that even though these forces, this show of power, this antagonism, clubs and swords came against him and Peter, God, his Father, knew what he was doing. Everything was okay. It was going to be okay. Jesus believing that nothing got to him, nothing reached him that hadn't crossed his Father's desk. That's how Jesus lived. He knew nothing got to him, nothing reached him that hadn't crossed his Father's desk, that hadn't been allowed by his loving, all-wise Father. Being secure in that knowledge, in that truth, unlike Peter, he was not drawn into a power struggle. A power struggle. So insecurity in Peter showed up as anger, as feeling threatened, as feeling powerless, Peter seeking to take control, being drawn into a conflict, a power struggle, and it can show up in us in the very same ways. Now, going back to what Jesus said to Peter after Peter cut off the high priest's servant's ear. I find that phrase very confusing. The high priest's servant's ear. You know, trying to keep straight whose ear we're talking about. It wasn't the high priest's ear, it was the servant's ear. And the ear belonged to the servant, and the servant belonged to the high priest. Okay, hopefully you've got that, okay? So after Jesus cut off the ear in question, let's just say that, Jesus said something to Peter. Jesus said something to Peter, some sobering words about insecurity, about how it operates, about what it will do to us if we continue to operate in insecurity. Jesus said this to Peter, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword." You know, there's more than one way to interpret these words of Jesus, but I want to give you my take on them in the context of what we're thinking about this morning. Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Insecurity is a sword. It's a sword. It wields weapons. We've spoken about how insecurity can lead to anger, trying to control a situation, a person, by anger. Insecurity is easily hurt. That hurt can easily give rise to anger. Insecurity can produce other weapons. It can cause us to be jealous. It can cause us to be resentful. It can cause us to be bitter about possibly what another person has, their talents, their popularity, their good looks, their good fortune, their fancy house, their fancy car. As Peter did with his sword, insecurity cuts others down. It takes them down. It buys into the lie that what matters most is not what God thinks about me, it's what others think about me. And so it's always competing, and it's always comparing. It does all it can to get ahead, and it does all it can to stop others getting ahead. That's insecurity. Insecurity pulls all these swords from its sheath. Anger and bitterness and jealousy and resentment and competing and comparing and rivalry and pulling others down. That's insecurity's armory, its whole set of swords with which it wages warfare against other people. It aims these barbs, these weapons, these destructive swords at others in a negative, hurtful, harmful way and spirit. Insecurity is very combative. It's always waging war with those around it, near it. Again, Jesus' words, his warning to Peter, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Living, acting out of insecurity is taking the sword. As we've said, insecurity wields a sword. It wields many swords: anger, jealousy, comparing, competing. And it wields those swords to take others down, to take others out, so others perish, so others fail, so others crash. But Jesus said all who take the sword will perish by the sword. He told us if we live out of insecurity, if we live in that spirit of taking others down, of wanting others taken down, of wanting others to perish, we are the ones who will perish. We are the ones who will come down. We are the ones who will be taken down by that stuff. The very swords, the very weapons we aim at others to take them down will take us down. Will take us down. Anger, bitterness, jealousy, resentment, wanting to take others down, those swords in us will do just as much damage to us as they will to others. Arguably more. More. If we take the sword, if we live by the sword of insecurity, we will perish by the sword. If we live out of insecurity, all that insecurity spawns and gives rise to within us, it will eat away at us from the inside out. It will destroy us from the inside out. It's dangerous stuff, insecurity. We need to address it and deal with it before it gets the better of us. So that's a look at Peter, at Jesus' betrayal, his insecurity and how it displayed itself, along with Jesus' warning to Peter, to us, that if we take the sword of insecurity, aiming it at others so they perish, that sword will come back on us and cause us to perish. And cause us to perish. I want to move on from that incident to Peter's denial of Jesus later in the chapter, where again I see lessons in insecurity, how it can affect us and what it can have us doing. In Peter, we've seen some of the faces of insecurity at Jesus' betrayal. At Peter's denial of Jesus, we see some different faces of insecurity. Like I've said, insecurity has a lot of faces. It can express itself in so many ways. Let's read the account. Matthew 26, I think we have that for you. Thanks, Karen. Matthew 26, 69 to 75. These are the last verses of the chapter. Let's read about Peter's denial of Jesus. So Matthew 26, 69 to 75. Here we go. Now Peter sat outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him saying, "You also are with Jesus of Galilee." But he denied it before them all, saying, I don't know what you're saying. And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth." But again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." And a little later, those who stood by came and said to Peter, "Surely you also are one of them, for your speech betrays you." Then he began to curse and swear, saying, "I do not know the man." And immediately a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the word of Jesus, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And so he went out and he wept bitterly. He wept bitterly. So Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane and was taken to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. And at the high priest's home, the scribes and elders were gathered, the religious council of the day, and they laid false charges against Jesus in an effort to find him guilty so they could put him to death. This group of religious leaders wanted blood. They wanted blood. They were very hostile towards Jesus. They were vehemently, violently anti-Jesus. And they wanted nothing short of Jesus' blood, his death. And Peter had followed the crowd who had arrested Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest's home, where he sat with the servants to see what would become of Jesus. And I imagine among the servants were some of those who had been sent by the chief priests and the elders with swords and clubs to arrest Jesus. So again, this was a group of people hostile towards Jesus. They did not like Jesus. And in that context, surrounded by people who were anti-Jesus, against him, who did not like Jesus, some maybe like the chief priest wanted him dead. In that crowd, a servant girl associated Peter with Jesus and said to Peter, "You also were with Jesus." And Peter denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you're talking about." And then Peter went out to the gate that led into the courtyard, and there another girl saw him. And she said to those who were there, "This fellow was with Jesus. He hung out with Jesus." And again, Peter denied knowing Jesus, this time with an oath. He made out that he had nothing to do with Jesus, had nothing to do with Jesus. That's how it went down. Now, why did Peter deny knowing Jesus? Why did he deny knowing Jesus, deny being connected with him in any way? I think there'd be a lot of ways to express that, to answer that question. Why possibly Peter denied Jesus? Obviously, the crowd had a lot to do with it. The context, where he was. This crowd to whom Jesus was Mr. Unpopular, who did not think well of Jesus. Peter didn't want that for himself. He didn't want to be unpopular with this crowd. He wanted to be accepted by the crowd. He wanted to be thought well of by the crowd. Peter cared more about what people thought about him just then than what God thought about him. He was afraid. He was afraid of what people would think of him. Afraid of being unpopular, afraid of being unwanted, afraid of being unvalued, afraid of being rejected. He was afraid of not being embraced by, not being one of the crowd. He was afraid of not belonging. Those are all signs, those are all products, those are all fruits of insecurity. Of insecurity. I want to ask this question: where was this insecurity coming from in Peter? Where was it coming from? We're not told, are we? We're not told. But I want you to imagine something with me. I want to take you on a little trip down Peter's life. Imagine this with me for a moment. So two of the people who pointed out that Peter had been with Jesus, was connected with Jesus, were girls. They were girls. One was a servant girl, it says, the other one just says was a girl. And I want to imagine they were slightly attractive girls. They were slightly attractive girls. And when they told everyone that Peter had been with Jesus, suddenly Peter was no longer in the courtyard outside the priest's home. He was back in his schoolyard. He was back in his schoolyard, and insecure 12, 13-year-old boys wanting the pretty girls to notice him. Wanting the pretty girls to notice him. The attractive girls in the schoolyard to like him, to value him. Why? Because in that social setting, in the world of 12, 13-year-old schoolboys, attractive girls are liked, they're important, they have status, they have social influence and power because they are popular, because they're socially looked up to, because they're socially valued. And if they liked you, you were liked. If they were like you, you had value. Because they were important, if they liked you, you were important. You had status, you had worth. But when Peter was a 12, 13-year-old boy in the schoolyard, hoping the pretty girls noticed him, trying to get their attention, was that really what it was about? Was that really what it was about? Girls on the schoolyard? Not in Peter's case. Not in Peter's case. In his case, the roots of all that went way further back in his life. They went way further back in his life, to his childhood, to things that happened and things that didn't happen back then in his childhood, early in his life, as a child, as an even younger boy, when the person who was most important in his life, most important in his life, in his world, hadn't noticed him, hadn't affirmed him, hadn't valued him. Never mind the attractive girls on the schoolyard, this person had molded, had shaped his life in much, much deeper ways than they had. I'm talking about Peter's dad. Peter's dad. His dad had been an amazing man. He'd been a fisherman like Peter, who loved his family, who did everything he could for them, to provide for them, to keep the bills paid, to keep them comfortable, to keep them in their small house on the edge of Bethsaida, on the Sea of Galilee. Peter's dad was his hero. Peter's dad was his hero, always busy, either out on the water catching fish or on the shore getting ready to catch fish, mending the nets, mending the boat. It was constant, day in, day out. And Peter would play on the beach, and his father would fly by. Gotta go, Peter. Lots of fish to catch. One day you'll be doing this. One day this will be your job. One day it'll be your boat. It'll be your nets. And Peter couldn't wait. Peter couldn't wait for the day he could be like Dad. He could do what Dad did. And so off his dad would go, off into the distance, onto the sea, not back till sundown with his catch of fish, while Peter played in the sand. Played all day in the sand, waiting for Dad to come home. What a hero, thought Peter. What a hero my dad is. What a hero out there working all day long, working in the heat to provide for me and Mum and my brother Andrew. Peter knew his dad, but from a distance. From a distance. There he was, far away, his hero on a pedestal. His hero on a pedestal. Peter on the beach all day, Dad out in the boat all day. And Dad was so busy providing, being a good dad in that way, he hadn't had time to be a good dad to Peter in other ways. In other ways. You see, in Peter's mind, obviously, Dad spent time doing what was most important. What was most important? What mattered most? Doing what was most valuable. That involved a lot of fishing and a lot of overlooking Peter. A lot of breezing by Peter. A lot of Peter going unnoticed, unseen, unattended to. And what that translated into in Peter's world was that he wasn't important. He didn't matter. He had little value. He wasn't wanted. That's what his dad's actions said to him. And that had left Peter with a great big hole inside him ever since his childhood. Ever since his childhood, he'd been trying to fill that hole by getting people, those around him, to want him, to value him, to like him, to embrace him, to notice him, not to overlook him, to affirm that he was important, that he mattered, whether it was the attractive girls on the schoolyard or it was the crowd outside Caiaphas' house. He wanted to be liked. He wanted to be valued. He wanted to be accepted. He wanted to be embraced because he hadn't been by the person who mattered most, his hero, his dad. All those years ago, on all those days spent on the beach, while Dad was miles away, doing, presumably attending to, the important stuff, what mattered most. So when in that hostile crowd, two girls, in my little imagination, two attractive girls to boot, said he'd been with Jesus, it all came crashing in on him. It all came crashing in on him. He imploded at that moment into this big black hole within him that had dogged him all his life. This huge black hole of insecurity that he carried. That at times he got the better of, but that day outside Caiaphas' house, he fell headlong into that hole. He fell headlong into that hole. All the wheels came off, and he fell victim to an unhealed and unresolved and unaddressed area of his heart, of his soul. Now, I've done a lot of imagination here, right? A lot of imagining, a lot of speculating. And I'm not trying to suggest that was really Peter's story. I'm just trying to illustrate a point. My point is that insecurity and issues like it can have very deep roots. Very deep roots. And it's possible some of those things were sown into our lives at a very early age on the beaches that we used to play on, wherever those were. An insecurity that may have come, that may have been part of us from a young age, that hasn't been addressed since our early years. Why, by the time we're 40, 50, 60 years old, whatever it may be, by then, after all the years, an issue like that has got huge within us. It has gone deep. It has grown all sorts of tentacles and roots. And I think that's why, as I said at the beginning, insecurity can pop up with all sorts of different faces, in all sorts of different ways. At times just blindsiding us, as it did Peter. Having us crash and fall, hijacking us, tripping us up, us falling victim to it, keeping us from who we're meant to be, keeping us from what we're meant to be, keeping us from what God wants us to experience and what he wants others to experience through us. Insecurity unaddressed will sabotage, it will paralyze, it will handicap our lives. It really will. It does a lot of damage. After Peter denied Jesus, he went out, it says, and he wept bitterly. He wept bitterly. After his insecurity got the better of him, there was deep regret, there was deep remorse. If we leave our own insecurity and insecurities unaddressed, they'll get the better of us. They'll get the better of us. They'll continue to shape what we feel, what we believe, what we do. And like Peter, we will weep bitterly. We will weep bitterly. There'll be deep regret and remorse over that. We will look back at all the missed and failed opportunities, all that insecurity robbed from us and kept us from, all we should have done that we didn't do, all we did do that we shouldn't have done because of insecurity, all that we were robbed of and those around us were robbed of. There'll be deep regret and remorse if we don't address our insecurity. And let's not allow that to happen. Let's identify. Let's recognize our own insecurity, our own insecurities. There's often many of them with a root of insecurity. Let's face it. Let's, with God's help, address it. And how we do that will be the subject of next week's message. As we did with the flesh and the spirit, we've been down sort of Peter's side of the ladder. Peter's side of insecurity, how not to do it. And next week, we're going to go down the other side of the ladder, Jesus' side of the ladder, how to do it, how to live secure, how to avoid insecurity. Though what we will also do, we will also look at is what happened to Peter after his denial of Jesus. How he did get healed. He did get delivered of his insecurity. But it's interesting, to the end of his days, insecurity dogged him. There was an incident after he'd had a lot of healing from his insecurity. And it popped up again. It reared its ugly head. And we'll talk about that next week. So bless you, folks.